We are learning disturbing new details about what's happening to children taken away from their parents after they crossed into the US. The Associated Press reports that facilities housing some of the youngest kids are being turned into so-called tender age shelters, similar to what you're seeing here. The report quotes unnamed lawyers and medical providers who say they've witnessed hysterical children crying out for their parents. In Washington, US President Donald Trump met with Republicans late Tuesday, but lawmakers say he barely touched on the issue of family separations and offered little clarity on pending legislation that might solve the problem. He continues to falsely blame Democrats for a policy he has the power to end. Condemnation of that zero-tolerance policy is spreading right around the globe. The Pope voiced support for US bishops who call it immoral. And Britain's Prime Minister weighed in just a few hours ago.
The pictures of children being held in what appear to be cages are deeply disturbing. This is wrong. This is not something that we agree with. This is not the United Kingdom's approach.
Well, Sarah Westwood joins me now from the White House. And Sarah, the president seems to be using this policy of ripping children away from their parents as a negotiating tactic to push through an immigration reform that includes funding for a border wall. But clearly that's not working. After meeting with Republicans, they still don't have a way to end this.
That's right. President Trump offering no clear pathway out of the mess that his own administration has created with its zero-tolerance immigration policy. Last night on Capitol Hill, President Trump did not give a clear signal to congressional Republicans about how or even whether he would address the crisis on the border should the several pieces of Republican legislation that's now being considered fail. There's not consensus within the GOP and certainly not among the Democrats about what approach to take, whether they should back a broader overhaul of the immigration system or a more narrow solution that just addresses family separation. A lot of confusion in Washington today.
And of course, it's pretty hard to believe, Sarah, that a former Fox News panelist and former Trump campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, reacting to an immigrant child with special needs. Let's just listen to some sound we've got of that.
I read today about a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was taken from her mother and put in a cage. I read about did you say want to a 10-year-old with Down syndrome being taken from her mother?
What I said is you can pick anything you want up, but the bottom line is very clear. When you cross the border illegally,
absolutely callous, showing no empathy whatsoever. He tried to clarify those comments a short time ago, again on Fox News, but didn't offer an apology to the girl. And we've also heard from President Trump describing these immigrants as infesting the U.S. You can see the tweet here saying they're pouring into and infesting our country. Are they trying to dehumanize these immigrants? And if so, who are they playing to?
Well, President Trump's language around immigration has always been controversial since he launched his political campaign in June 2015, but certainly in the context of these images that we're seeing of children who are being torn away from their mothers, crying in cages, it's inflaming tensions a lot more. And clearly President Trump is not backing down from his tough immigration stance. Even during this emotionally charged time, he is betting, and perhaps incorrectly, that his base is backing this hardline immigration policy.
All right, Sarah Westwood, we'll leave it there for now, but we are staying on this story. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, President Trump congratulated his Homeland Security Secretary for defending the family separation policy at a press conference Monday. A day later, Kristen Nielsen got a very different reception when she went out to dinner at a Mexican restaurant.
Shame! 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 Shame!
You can hear their protesters heckling Nielsen as she left. Then they posted that video on Facebook. One demonstrator says they refused to let her dine in peace while families are being torn apart. Well, the images of children being separated from their parents at the U.S. border with Mexico are heart-wrenching. Perhaps none have come to symbolize the crisis more than this 2-year-old from Honduras. She was taken from her mother after they rafted across the Rio Grande from Mexico. Now they're hearing from the little girl's father.
¿Quién a usted me partió el alma? Me partió el alma porque ver a mi niño, o sea, la primera entrada, pues le dije, esta es mi niña, no. Desde que la vi, antes de que pasaron el reportaje, ella es mi niña. Se me partió el alma, o sea.
¿Lloraste?
No, sí, claro. Claro, son duritas, pues.
¿Te da mucha tristeza recordarla, verdad, verla así como estaba llorando?
Yo creo que no se merece la situación ella de mi niña, no se merece la situación esa. Me parte el alma.
Well, I want to welcome a guest, Wendy Young, the president of Kids in Need of Defense, also known as KIND. She joins us from our Washington bureau. Good to have you with us. I want to ask you firstly about these tender shelters, these warehouses that are being used to detain babies and toddlers. I understand one is a warehouse in Houston. They're looking to open another. We're not allowed in them, but from what we're hearing from those that have visited, from Democrats, from lawyers, they say there's no bedding, no sheets, no toys. There's hysterical babies and toddlers, preschoolers crying in these rooms. What's your reaction?
Well, these are shelters that were set up to welcome children who actually arrive unaccompanied, without a parent, and they're typically used as processing centers to release those vulnerable children to family members who are already here in the United States. They have never been used before for the purposes of separating families at our border. These are children who've arrived in the United States already traumatized by the conditions that they fled in their home countries in Central America, the very difficult trip to the United States, and now they're facing even more abuse at the hands of the U.S. government by being ripped from the arms of their parents. These kids are in incredibly vulnerable situations, and the consequences of this new policy are going to be long-term for these children.
We heard through one of our reporters that a Republican said in a closed meeting that the President of the United States said we need to stop these crying babies. Politically, it's not good. Does it sound to you like he cares more about the optics than the actual families?
Sorry, I could not hear that.
President Trump spoke to a closed meeting of Republicans. One of those Republicans spoke to one of my colleagues, Donna Bush, and said that President Trump is worried about how this looks politically. He said we need to stop those crying babies. Does it sound to you like the president cares more about the optics than the actual families at the center of this crisis?
These children are being used as political pawns by the Trump administration. They are trying to achieve the immigration legislation that they've been pushing for months now. They're targeting the most vulnerable people on the move in the world, which are children, in order to achieve their political purposes. It's a heartless policy that is manipulating and using laws that are in place actually to protect children in order to achieve their law enforcement means.
The Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, said the kids are fine. They have televisions. And we saw in that vision just a short time ago her being booed out of a Mexican restaurant when she went for dinner. We also heard from the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, saying some of these kids are looked after better than American children. What's your message to the government?
It doesn't matter if these children have a bed or a meal. The fact is they're locked up. And even more importantly, they've been separated from their parents. That is about the most horrific thing you can do to a child, particularly children of tender years. So you can't lock them up in cages. You can't treat them as if they're animals and think that this isn't going to have a long-term impact on these children. It doesn't matter how nice you are to them while they're in that facility. You can't put lipstick on this policy. It is incredibly harsh and cruel.
There's no doubt some of these children might eventually be granted asylum in the U.S. Talk to us about the long-term impacts they may suffer as a result of this detention.
Well, what should be happening is that these families should be either released together or placed into a community care program so that we know where they are, so that they can pursue their claim for asylum. These are people who are fleeing extreme violence in Central America that's caused by gangs. And in our work with children, we have talked to kids who have seen family members, friends murdered. We've worked with girls who've been raped, sometimes gang raped. children who've been abducted. They have no choice but to flee to the United States and seek asylum. So the administration is trying to circumvent that process to send a message back to families who are considering making the trip to the United States that they shouldn't make the trip and to punish those that arrive.
All right, really good to get your perspective, Wendy Young. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, in about 20 minutes' time, we'll be live in Texas with the latest on the so-called tender age shelters. Facilities where babies, infants, toddlers are being held after being taken away from their parents.